Hey everybody, Jane here, and I want to talk to you about the 11 books I read or tried to read in the month of February. So, February ended up being for me a little bit on the slumpy side. A lot of these books are shorter, they're mangas, they're graphic novels. We did have a couple long reads, but I just was struggling with reading. I have been having a little bit of fatigue going on. I don't know if it's seasonal. We've had a lot of snow this month and just a lot of cold, yucky weather. So I don't know if that was the issue or if I'm just slumpy in general. But that being said, this is a little bit less than I normally read. However, I did have some really good finds, and overall, I enjoyed what I was reading. So those things are all a win. I did have one book I DNF'd, and that was Hang the Moon. This is a rom-com, and it is about Annie and Brendan. So Annie is about to move to London for a new job, and she wants to go visit her friend Darcy one more time before the move. Darcy lives in Seattle, and Annie lives, I believe, in Philadelphia. She gets to Seattle and calls Darcy and is like, "Hey, surprise, I'm here to see you." And Darcy says, "Oh no, I am on vacation. So my brother's gonna have to come and let you in my apartment, and I'll be back in a few days and then we can hang out." So Annie's like, "Okay, I'll keep myself busy for a few days while I wait for you to come back." So Brendan is Darcy's little brother who comes, lets her in, and is like, "Hey, since my sister's not here, I'll show you around and we can have a good time until sister comes back." Brendan has always had a bit of a crush on her, and so this was not a huge hardship for him. I ended up just not connecting with these characters. There is a lot of humor, and I understood why it was funny, but it didn't always hit for me. And I just, at about the 35% mark, decided that I didn't have any desire to finish this book, and so I didn't. I think if you really like rom-com and you don't mind if they're a little bit goofy, you could really appreciate this. Also, I think part of my frustration came from the Annie Darcy dynamics. The scene that was the last one that I read that I was like, I can't go any further on, was Darcy and Annie having an argument about Annie moving. And this was very difficult for me because I am or was formerly a military spouse, and my best friend is also a military spouse. And so, like, we had lots of times where we were not in close proximity, but still able to maintain the friendship. So it was really hard for me to understand why Darcy was being kind of a jerk about the whole situation. And it made her very unsympathetic to me. And I wasn't super invested in the problem because we also learned that Annie is not really excited about this job. It's just a job that she's taking. And so it felt like she could easily solve all the problems of, "Oh, I want to be here with Brendan and my bestie. I'll just nope out of this job I don't really want anyway." So, yeah, it just wasn't for me. It could really be for you, especially these characters acted a little on the younger side. Maybe that would work better for you. It didn't hit for me. All right, so now on to my 3-star reads because I did not have any 1 stars and did not have any 2 stars. If you're new here, that's pretty typical for me. I don't give books 1 stars unless I feel like they're borderline unreadable. And of course, if they are that, I'm probably going to have already DNF'd them. And then 2 stars are what I give to books that I think have very, very serious flaws in them that make them objectively bad. If a book is at least objectively fine, it will get a 3-star. So, my 3-star reads for the month. The first one we have is The Ocean at the End of the Lane. I know that this author is very controversial right now. I read this so that I could get it off my shelves, and that is exactly what I'm going to be doing. It is a book that I bought as a used library copy several years ago, and just I wanted to read it before I unhauled it just to make sure I didn't like it, but I wasn't a fan. This is about a little boy. Well, it's about an adult man who comes back to his street where he grew up and reminisces about being a 7-year-old boy and some weird stuff that happened during that time. This book, I didn't enjoy it. I think what I can say about this is that it reminds me of abstract art. I needed something a little more concrete. This book was not it. And like, I can appreciate abstract art from the fact of it's pretty colors, but I prefer art where I know what I'm looking at. And this book felt like I didn't really know what I was looking at, and it wasn't concrete enough for me. I needed a little bit more from it. So yeah, this one was not a win. The next 3-star I have is Magical Boy Volume 1. I read Volume 2 for Pride, I believe. This is about a trans boy who has superpowers that are typically given down to the descendants of the goddess Aurora through the female line. And he is having a hard time dealing with these new powers and having to save the world while also dealing with the implications of what a female-led power means and how that affects him as a boy. He's also dealing with people in his family who, his dad's really supportive of him being a boy, but his mother is not. The mother was the previous superhero that was Aurora's line, and doesn't understand why her son can't embrace these powers the way that she did. This book it's middle grade, and I think that's my issue with it. It was fine. It was a little bit preachy, over your head, over the top. The superhero part I didn't super enjoy. I did enjoy the conversations that he was having throughout the story, and trying to deal with his identity while also becoming a superhero that was passed down the way it was. And it's an interesting idea. I didn't hate it. It just wasn't anything special to me. Now we can move on to the 4 stars that I had. And the first one was Kit McBride Gets a Wife. This one and The Ocean at the End of the Lane, and actually Hang the Moon as well, all were ones that I read for Buzzwordathon, and that is a separate video if you'd like more detailed thoughts about these books. This is marketed as a rom-com. I don't think that it is. It is humorous, it is historical fiction, it is women's fiction. It is not really, in my opinion, a romance. The setup is we have Junebug, who is the younger sister of Kit. Junebug is tired of being stuck doing all the laundry, all the housework for her brothers who live out in, I want to say it's Montana. They live like out west type thing. And her brothers, are all older, they're all working, and she is the youngest. She's a teenager. I think she's 14. So anyway, she puts out a advertisement trying to get a wife for her brother Kit, but she deceptively makes it seem like Kit is the one advertising. You have Maddie, who is working for the widow who answers Kit's advertisement. The widow comes out, is like, I don't think I'm interested in this place. This is not the life of luxury that I'm used to. And she basically tells Maddie, I can't pay you, I'm leaving you here, and you can have the husband I was supposed to meet. Well, Maddie didn't want the husband, that was not her dream. But she's hoping that by going to Kit and asking for a return ticket back home, that he, again, the assumption is he was the one writing about it to her, that he will be merciful and give her this return ticket. She arrives, she almost immediately has an accident where she becomes unconscious and cannot explain who she is, and Junebug asks her to keep the secret and to pretend that she is indeed the wife that Junebug ordered for Kit. This book has too much focus on Junebug, and while I did give it a 4-star because I thought it was a very funny read, there's really not much romance. I'd gotten into this wanting a historical marriage of convenience, thing. And there are some sweet moments between Kit and Maddie, but this is really not romance as far as it's not character centered. It's not romance centered. You have way too much Junebug, way too much interactions with Maddie and Junebug and Maddie and everybody else, and not nearly enough with Maddie and Kit. I did, however, think that this was humorous and a fun enough read. I didn't hate it. I just thought it was not a good romance. So if you're looking for a book that is funny, historical, and not a romance, this might work for you. Do not get this if you want a romance, because it is not. I also had some issues with a couple things at the end, but again, overall, it was fun. I had a good time. Next book was one that I consumed via audiobook, and it was called James. A lot of people are talking about James, and I did do a video with my detailed thoughts, so I'll try to be brief here. James is a retelling or reimagining of Huckleberry Finn through the lens of James, who in Huckleberry Finn was called Jim. I think this is an interesting retelling. It does not follow Huckleberry Finn very closely, especially past the half mark. There are a lot of choices the author made that I understood why they made them, but I didn't personally like them. I had moments where I had some trouble with believability. Also, this book is not great to women. There are only, I think, a few female characters, and the female characters are just there to show the terrible abuse that was being done to the women who were slaves. And I think that's an important story. I don't think that's unimportant, but I think it's very frustrating to just have women on scene who are just there to die and be abused. So I did have some frustrations with that as a female. I don't want to have a lot of opinions about this because I am not a person of color, and I think this is the kind of book that we really need person of color voices on to say whether it reflects what they think it needed to be. I did enjoy it as a read. I had a good time with it. I thought it was interesting and thought-provoking even when I didn't necessarily think that it was realistic, and when I didn't like what the changes the author made to the story. And there were things that, like the ending, I felt was really rushed. Maybe it had to be, but I could see the merit in it. I think it was an objectively well-written book with interesting literary reasons, and I enjoyed a lot of my journey with it. But there were things that I didn't like. I think that's the best. I'm going to leave it at that. That's what I'm going to say about it. The next book was a nonfiction that I was stoked to read. It was called Stowaway, The Disreputable Exploits of the Rat. So, anybody who doesn't know, I am currently hyper-focused on rats. I really want pet rats. We currently have a hamster and are going to wait until the hamster passes to get rats. She's a 2-year-old hamster. Hamsters typically live from 2 to 4 years, so it's probably likely that the rats will happen in the next year or two, but not super soon. So until we can get rats, and please note, like, my hamster, we're giving her the very best life possible. She just is not very loving and handleable, and so we were like looking for, okay, after she passes, what is our next lovely pet? Anyway, nonfiction book on rats, very much my hyper focus. This book was objectively very good for a nonfiction. I was very engaged in a lot of it. It is a guy who is studying rats. Now, he does at one point get pet rats, which I was just thrilled about. And he talks about like his relationship with his rats while he's also looking at rats in a bigger picture vermin kind of way. This book does have a lot of rat hunting. It has a lot of how rats live in the wild. It has why they're such good vermin and pests and why they exist and continue and are very hard to eradicate. Obviously, as a rat lover, those were not my favorite parts of the book. There was also, of course, discussion about domestication. I don't know if there was discussion about lab rats, although I think there should have been because lab rats are incredibly important as well in science. This book had moments it really dragged, but also moments where I was literally crying because of interactions he had with his own pet rats. So this book I think if you love rats, it's a hard to read because of the extermination chapters. It also, in general, has moments where it really drags, but I loved all the insight we get into the secret life of rats. And I think if you can step back and not mind the extermination bits, it's very educational and interesting about what rats really are and how amazing they are as a species. Like, I feel like you cannot walk back from this book and be like, oh yeah, rats are boring. No, no, rats are really cool. And this book is very good at like putting the camera on rats are really cool creatures. And they are. My next 4-star was another nonfiction, and that is How to Write a Dynamic Scene Using the Snowflake Method. This was also in my vlog, my Buzzwordathon blog, so I'm not going to go too into detail of this. I think I also did, or I'm going to do a video for this by itself. I've been trying to do a more detailed review on the nonfiction writing related books for anybody following my channel who is also an author. What I will say about this book is I didn't realize going into it that it was part of a bigger series about the Snowflake method. This book does not do a good job at explaining what the Snowflake method is. However, it is a good book on writing scene and sequel, although it's not called that. Back when I took creative writing classes, it was called writing scene and sequel. This guy calls it, I think, active and reactive scenes, which is basically scene and sequel. So it was interesting. It had to do with like he wants you to turn stories, like each scene should be almost a short story, not a vignette, but like an interwoven short story type thing. So I thought there was some valid ideas here, especially about conflict within scenes. There was some really excellent quotes, especially on like what tales are. Here's one I really liked. Our ancestors told stories about the things they feared most. Why? Because story changes you, story makes you strong, story makes you brave, story gives you hope, story keeps you alive through the darkest night. So there are some absolutely beautiful, especially in the early part of this book, quotes about why story is important. I think if you are a beginner writer, this is probably a really valuable book. If you're a more advanced writer, you may not get as much from it because hopefully you already know how to do scene and sequel. This is pretty basic beginner stuff, but I didn't hate it. It was a quick read. I had a lot of moments that I highlighted, and I am going to be passing this on to my writing group for other newer writers to enjoy. The next read was a graphic novel, and it was book 1 of Morgana and Oz. So, quick reason I got into this to begin with is I have been spending too much time on Goodreads, particularly in the giveaway section, and I saw Morgana and Oz book 2 and it looked really cute, and I was like, I wonder if my library has book 1. So I went and I looked, and they do. This is about a girl who's a witch, and she is not good with her powers, and Oz is a vampire who she accidentally turns into a cat. Let me see if I can show you. Yeah, that's him. He's so cute. So who she accidentally turns into a cat, and they're trying to more or less deal with her turning him into a cat, get that reversed, and also like deal with the complex things between the vampires and the witches. This was cute. I had a good time with it. I understood it, which I don't always with graphic novels. The art was absolutely delightful. It was funny, and I really, this was what I wanted the graphic novel to be, and so it was 4 stars. The next 4-star I had was Ascendance of a Bookworm. This is part 2, volume 3. If you're a book lover and enjoy manga, I feel like this is a pretty safe bet series for you. It is about a little girl who, well, it's about a woman who dies, and like her thing is I just am obsessed with books, and she is reincarnated, although reincarnated not how I imagine reincarnation. She's like zapped into the body of this child in another world, and this world struggles with poverty and doesn't have books. So this little girl's whole thing is I just want to read all the books, so I'm going to invent crap so that I can have books, even if I have to make all the books. We're kind of far. As I said, we're already in part 2. This is more of the same. There is moments where I get frustrated with the series because she's bringing stuff from our world and adding it to this world, and it does or doesn't work. But like, also people in that world should have taken care of these problems a long time ago. But still, it's cute, it's sweet, I enjoyed it. The next one is I got fired as a court wizard, so now I'm moving to the country to become a magic teacher. This is also a manga. The title pretty much says what this is. This guy is sent to teach the worst of the worst magic students, and it's fun. I enjoyed it. I'm gonna read more. My library didn't have the next book yet, but when they do, I plan to read it. All right, the last book I read in the month of February was my 5-star. And like, it's a Ruby Dixon, so is anybody really surprised it was 5-star? Now, I will say, this one's one I had a really hard time deciding if it was a 5-star, but I read it in 3 days, and it's an audiobook that was like 18 hours, so I'm like, I kind of feel like I have to rate that a 5-star. I really loved it, but it was like probably closer to a 4.75. It was right on that cusp. I didn't love it as much as like I really love some of the Ice Planet Barbarian books, but that is Bull Moon Rising. This book is about Asbeth, who she comes from a wealthy family. But the family has squandered their wealth away. And in this world, part of wealth is these magical artifacts that do defensive stuff. And if it's found out that her father has gambled away these artifacts, people will attack her land holdings and kill her family, and kill like the servants and people associated with her family. It will be very bad. So she decides that to save her family, because she is also the only child in the heir, she is going to become an artificer. And their job is to locate artifacts. And she wants to locate these artifacts and send them back to her father. But she has to join the Artificer Guild. And they are not a fan of women. There's a ton of misogyny in this place. They don't like anybody who is not them. So she meets a guy who is a Taurian. He's basically a Minotaur. They're called Taurians. And he is a teacher in the guild, but he can't like up his rank because he's not human. So she asks him to teach her, and he's like, I can't teach you because you have to have a chaperone. And she's like, well, how do I get a chaperone? He's like, well, here's the ways you do it. And she is like, hey, he also has an issue. Which he tells her around the same time. He's like, I'm not taking you on. I'm already having a rough time. He is like the assistant teacher, and the teacher who is supposed to be the teacher, her name is Magpie. She is an alcoholic who has been shirking her duties. He feels indebted to her, so he is like still trying to train her students and make sure she doesn't get in trouble. But he also has the difficult issue of it is about to be some magical moon thing that he's going to go into heat. They call it rut, which makes sense, I guess, for Minotaur. I've never read Omegaverse, but this gives me Omegaverse vibes, but with Minotaurs. From what I understand about Omegaverse, this seems like it's very Omegaverse, but with Minotaurs. Anyway, he is about to go into rut, and he is going to just be mindless and crazy, and he needs somebody to help him during that time so that he can complete his duties while not being absolutely insane from this God's hand on his, parts. So she's like, hey, how about we solve both of our problems? I'll marry you, you be my chaperone, and then when the time is right and the moon is on you, I'll handle the wife stuff. I can do that. And at first he's like, that sounds like a terrible idea. But he also doesn't know that she's royal, or like that she's not royal, but he doesn't know who she is, that she's the daughter of like a landholder and that they're upper class. He thinks she's just a merchant's daughter. He knows that she's not. He knows that she's something. She's obviously well educated and well dressed, but he assumes that she is a merchant's daughter, not like a landholder's daughter. Anyway, they're like, yes, we'll get married. and then once the moon passes and you get approval into the Artificers Guild, we can get divorced. It's fine. So marriage of convenience, one of my favorite tropes, and one that I think Ruby Dixon does really well. I will say, if you are picking up this book because you like Ice Planet Barbarians, this may not be the book for you because this is not Ice Planet Barbarians. And for me, that was a very good thing, actually, because Ice Planet Barbarians, one of the complaints I often have is there's too much science fiction in my romance. This book, I did not have that complaint that there was too much fantasy in my romance, but there is a lot of fantasy. You have very close relationship between Asbeth and the other students who are in her class. Each class has 5 students. So it's 4 other people in her class. One is a turtle, and then the others are girls because this is like the class that nobody wants. And so you have a lot of these relationships. You have the interesting interactions of learning about these artifacts, seeing them train. It was such a good time. But that's not normally, like, when I do Ice Planet, I want the romance and I want the steam and I don't care so much about the sci-fi. In this, I was really invested in the fantasy. And at some times I was like, I wish this wasn't a spicy book because I want to recommend this book for the plot to people. But the people that I would want to recommend it to would not read it because of the romance. Like, I was like, man, I wish my brother could read this book. Like, not the romance part, but the rest of it's really cool. This is a really cool world and a really cool setup, and I'm really enjoying and engaging with these artifact hunters. But there is a lot of spice in this book, and this is definitely a book that melds the two things. You cannot, if you're a fantasy reader who has never read spice, you probably won't enjoy this. And then if you're a spicy reader who just wants the spice, you're not going to enjoy this either. So I think it's really hard to find that balance. It happened to work really well for me, though. I do have some complaints. I felt like the spicy bits, especially like the big thing, the big spicy bits, didn't really work for me. I wanted the spice differently. I didn't hate it. I was a little disappointed and let down because we have all this big build up to this moon thing, and it wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. Also, I felt like a lot of things happened at the end that were very, this thing solves all the problems. And you're like, well, that's dumb because nobody told us that that was an option to solve the problems. And I mean, it was like, it kind of was hinted at, but only in the most obscure way that I don't see how you could know that this was a thing that would solve the problems. I felt like the ending didn't work as well as the rest of the book, but I totally binged this book, and up until the ending was super engaged, and even the ending wasn't terrible. I don't want to give that impression. I just was like, oh, this is it, huh? Okay. I mean, awesome for Asbeth, but it just was kind of a very neat, wrapped up with a bow, where the rest of the book was not. But it was still a really, really good book. I'm still absolutely going to read the sequel, which I believe comes out in September. And of course, I love Ruby. So this book really hit well, even though it does not, again, feel like a Ruby book. You could see the Ruby in parts of it, but then there was parts where I'm like, oh, I'm reading a Ruby book. Oh, really? This doesn't feel like a Ruby book. It's great, but it doesn't feel like a Ruby book. So just know that going into it. This is not Ice Planet Barbarians. This is something completely different. And like I said, it's a little bit more like how I understand the Omegaverse bit to be, as opposed to like the normal Ice Planet Barbarian tropes that I'm used to. I really liked it. Yeah, great time. Will read more. Ruby Dixon just writes stuff that really works for me, and I love it. All right, guys, this has been Jane. Please tell me in the comments if you read any of these books, and if so, what you thought of them. Also, tell me what your best read and worst read of February were. Like, subscribe, and I will talk to you next time. Bye! Pictures and patterns put into words that stream across the page.